everybody, it is Dean Z speaking to you from my basement. So what does that mean? That means we are going to be doing some application reads today. Specifically, I'm going to be reading applications from people who are what the kids call K through JD, meaning people who went from kindergarten through high school, immediately into college, and are applying in their senior year of college to attend law school. So they're looking at doing 19 years in a row of schooling. I've had a lot of people ask me to do K through JD file reads, and I think the first question is why? What's different about K through JD? What might I be looking for that is a little different than if I'm reading an application of somebody who's had a few years of work experience? And there's two things really. One is I'm always a little bit curious, the question is raised in my mind when I'm looking at someone who's a senior and applying. Has this person really put thought into going to law school? There are a number of ways you can demonstrate that, and we'll talk about that. What I don't want is someone who's sort of on a treadmill or on autopilot or simply can't figure out what they want to do after college. So they're like, I don't know, I'm good at taking tests, so I'll take the LSAT and maybe I'll get into law school. I want someone who wants to be here, who's put some affirmative thinking into this, because law school is tough and it's not great to do that without having put thought in it. The second big difference is sort of obvious. You don't have that few years of work after college. Now, I am well aware that people can have 40 years of work after college and not have matured during that time. But having, being 21 is often very different than the same person at age 23 or 24. And so it is helpful to, the maturing process and just being a little more resilient, a little more ready to engage in the hard work of law school if you've had the opportunity to work for a couple of years and go from there, from the working world into law school. And it's time to think about, what works for you in the workplace, like what are your goals for your job, what kinds of tasks do you like to do, that it's not only about deciding that law school is right, it also gives you time to think about what you want to do as a lawyer. It is possible, fully possible to get that information and go through that maturing process without having the work experience. But that's one of the things you're looking for as a reader. Okay, so let's dive in. I've got 3 applications I'm going to look at. All 3 are people who are above median LSAT, below median GPA. The difference of above and below varies quite a lot with the candidates, so we'll talk about that and see what difference that makes. And 2 of the applicants are people who we did admit, and one is someone we did not admit. And I'm going to start with that one, the latter, the not admit, on the theory of let's start with the tough stuff and then end on a high note. Okay, so let's get started. The first candidate here is someone I'm going to call Gina. See if you can figure out my theme as we go through here. Okay, so Gina is from Illinois, and I can see in her application form, she is attending the flagship public university in a different Midwestern state, and her mother lives in that state, the state where where she's attending school, and she chooses not to give information about a second parent. So I presume, I'm in the wrong place here. I presume that that means that she is not on good terms with her father. Maybe she'll talk about that, maybe she won't, but okay, that's something I'm noticing. And let's see, what else is interesting here? She speaks a little bit of a second language beyond English that is she presumably learned in school. She says she's proficient as opposed to native or fluent. It's a tough language though, so that I won't I'm trying always not to give revealing information about these candidates, so I won't say what language it is exactly, but it's a tougher one with a different lettering system, not an English type alphabet. Okay, and now I'm looking at her resume. I can see she has 2 majors of both philosophy and psychology, and she has done, even though she is, I've already said, a below median GPA, she's done well enough that she's been on the honor roll at this school several times, and she did study abroad. Okay, now let's get down to the work. So she's done some volunteer work for a court, but pretty minimal. She just started it this year, and she's volunteering for 4 hours a week. She also volunteers with a church, and she was the co-founder of the moot court at her school, which is interesting because it's a big-ish school. So I'm sort of surprised that they didn't already have a moot court. Neither here nor there, just noting that. And also she was involved in mock trial for a year previously. All these volunteer things, though, that she's in the moot court they're all pretty recent, from about a year before she applied. So and now I'm looking at her work experience, and it isn't robust. It's all campus work. So she's worked as an RA and is an office assistant, and as a debate coach too. So that's not on campus. That's for a public high school. But all of these are part-time jobs. And again, she's only listing stuff from starting about a year before her application. So that's a little bit of a concern to me. Like, she has not had any sustained work. At no point has she worked more than 12 hours a week, including in the summer. At least if she hasn't told me about it. So that's a little bit of a red flag, right? Not a little bit. That's kind of a red flag. That's a red flag. Just gonna be assertive here, Sarah. Okay. So I'm not loving that to begin with. Okay, now I am looking at her personal statement, and it starts off not great. It is talking about her elementary school experience and how a teacher in elementary school did not like her because she was defiant. And she specifically, this is 2nd grade, and she talks about how the applicant, got into trouble for defending a classmate who she feels the teacher was being racially discriminatory towards. I am a little dubious about that. Like, I feel, it's your perceptions of things that happen when you're 7, and your memory at age 22 of things that happen when you're 7. Probably not the greatest, and I am just dubious about the extent to which a 7-year-old really stood up to a teacher and did anything meaningful to help her classmate. She's sort of putting herself out there as a hero to her classmate, and I'm just skeptical about how realistic that is. Now, I'm not calling her a fibber here. I believe that she believes this is her story, but I'm skeptical. And then she pivots from that to talking about her parents' divorce. So, and it is, it sounds like it was a very unpleasant divorce, and I'm not surprised that she chose not to give me any information about her father. She clearly feels, she clearly estranged from him and has ill will that seems that he definitely earned. But it isn't, it's not a positive story. And then she moves from that to talking about her interest in politics and her involvement in the Black Lives Matter movement, which again, that claim is not in any way reflected in the activities she tells me about. And then she pivots again to talking about one of her volunteer experiences. Okay, there's a number of things wrong with this, a 3-page essay. It's trying to do too much. It's talking about way too many topics, way too briefly. Many of the topics are negative in that she's unhappy, she's complaining, which I'm not saying you should never complain, but in the course of 3 pages, like it's not telling me anything affirmative and positive about her. It's telling me a lot of negative things about other people. So it's not getting the job done in terms of creating a positive impression of her. I really don't know that much about her. And I do get the impression, to the extent she is telling me about her, I get the impression she is overselling it a little bit, in terms of how much of I'm going to use the word savior she's been to people in her life. I'm dubious. So let's see. Now we have an optional essay, and that also starts out really poorly. She specifically says, "To be frank, I dislike the culture and most of the people I met on her mock trial team." And then she talks about what she did to do it and how she starts the other group, the moot court, instead, because she didn't like it. And she again is talking about what she believes to be mistreatment of some people on her team on the basis of race. She's not really talking about anything that she did. Honestly, she's sort of talking about these people who she thinks were discriminated against. She's sort of using them as pawns in her story. They are not fleshed out in any way. She doesn't seem to have much of a relationship with them. She's just noting the injustice and her own dislike of it, which is a reasonable thing. But it seems to be a theme here. She has a lot of she takes a lot of issue with what other people are doing and is setting herself up as the hero in a way that I don't find convincing. And then finally, her last essay is about coming out to her mother, and that is that's the best of these essays. It talks about the tension between her and her mother on this score, but it's not as negative as the other ones. So this last one is the best of the 3, and it is, if it were standing alone, I think it would be pretty good, but it isn't quite enough to overcome the negative impression I've already formed from the prior 2 essays, and it's not great, right? It's not great on its own. It's a pretty superficial treatment of this issue. It isn't enough to make me feel like, oh yes, I really feel strongly that this person would make a positive contribution to the classroom. And then finally, she winds up with an LSAT addendum where she talks about how there's a big distinction between her first and second scores. We will get to that. And that's because she didn't really prepare well the first time, and then she did more the second time. So that's helpful to know. I'm glad she told me that, because there is indeed a gigantic difference between her scores of 16 points. So if you have that big a jump, it is really helpful if you can identify something to say so. Sometimes you can't, right? Like sometimes you just don't know. You took it twice. One time it worked, one time it didn't. So that's fine. But if you have something you can point to, even better. And I should say her second score is in the 99th percentile. And all right, and now I'm looking at her transcript. Her GPA is 3.6 and change, which is definitely a solid, so below median, but a totally solid GPA. With that LSAT and that GPA, I have no doubts that she could do the work here if we were to admit her. The question is whether we want her in the community. And okay, so looking at her transcript, which is tiny little print, so bear with me. She came into school with a ton of credits from taking AP courses in high school and stuff like that. So she came in with, at a pretty high level, and she has done well in her grades. It's all A's and B's. There's one C plus in a stats course, but otherwise all A's and B's. So that's all good. But she has taken lots of credits every semester. So in addition to being going straight through, she's only, at the time she's applying in her senior year, she's only had 2 full years of schooling previously. So she's going to graduate with only 3 years of school. So that also helps explain why she has relatively little in the way of work experience on her resume. And then finally, I'm looking at her letters of rec, and this is interesting. One of her letters of rec specifically talk about an incident in a class where the Gina got angry about something another student had said. There was another student who asked a question about a topic that Gina felt was ill-formed and exclusionary, and then it's clear that Gina did not handle it really well. The professors being very gentle, but clearly, wasn't great. And then she says, I have seen Gina mature since then. That's a little bit of a red flag. And then the only other letter of recommendation comes from a coach that she worked with in the context of moot court. And it's positive, but it's a little, for someone who is coming straight through from undergrad, I'd want to see at least 2 letters from professors. So that was an opportunity missed. So all in all, there is nothing terrible about this application, but it isn't, it's just not doing what it needs to do to get me feeling enthused about admitting her, to be very frank. I think she could stand to mature a bit, and I feel like it will be a little bit of a challenge for her to get a job because of her lack of work experience and what I suspect will be a demeanor in an interview that will seem young. So we did not choose to admit her. Again, this is not like, sometimes when I'm doing these and looking at applicants that we choose not to admit, there's like something really glaring, really problematic. This is not that. It's just you know, I can imagine overlooking some of the things that I'm troubled by in the application. In this case, if this had been somebody who had some work experience um, that was interesting or gave me just something else to look at. As it is, I just don't have much to look at here that's positive, and I'm seeing some red flags. So despite, a stellar LSAT and a very solid undergraduate record, I am not going to go ahead and admit. So now let us move on to people who fared better. I am going to call this next applicant Jake. I'm looking at the application and I can tell that this person, okay, they were actually born in another country and now are living in the Southwest United States. They are going to school near where where their family is, and it's not the flagship university in this state, but it is a very solid public institution that I'm pretty familiar with, so that's good. They note that they're fluent in another language. I'm not going to say what the language is because this is a very unusual language, and so I'm not going to say anything identifying, but they did learn English starting around age 5, so obviously they are native level English speaker. And they are a U.S. citizen. I'll note that. Okay. I'm curious if they'll tell me anything about what made them, what led to their family to come here. That might be an interesting story, but maybe they won't focus on that. Let's keep reading. Okay, so they're at this public institution, not the flagship. They are getting a bachelor's in economics, which is, a tough major. I mentioned that they are below median GPA. So knowing that they're taking a tough major, that's some helpful. They mentioned that they were on the dean's list for one semester, the semester before the term in which they are applying. And then I can see now, I'm looking at their work experience. They've had a lot of work experience, both during the school year and in the summers. So right now, this year, they are working as an LSAT tutor, and they specify that they're working about 20 hours a week doing that. So that's a pretty big time commitment. They also work as a debate judge, that when they say variable hours, no more than 20 hours a week. So and they've been doing that since their very first year in college. So that's a long-term commitment. That's interesting. And then they list a bunch of summer jobs, working at a supermarket, working at a tacos restaurant. I see they were customer service ward at the taco restaurant, so they're good at that. And then they have also done a lot of work as a delivery driver for a full year a little while ago. That ended about a year ago, a year before they were applying. These are all older applications, so I'm trying to do the math in my head. So, and then they also, so then they have some other little jobs, all customer service type jobs here. So they've been very busy just doing work and school. And there's not a ton of, law related work here, but test prep is not, being an LSAT tutor is not what I would call law related work. But, I think the extended work doing debate stuff, it reflects a long running interest in the law. So that gets rid of some of the concern that I sometimes have about people coming through from undergrad. And then I also see they've done a lot of extracurriculars. And one is on the law review that the school that they go to has. Sometimes undergraduate schools have those. They are the president of the law review. So that's impressive to me because they're working, they're going to school, and they've also made a time commitment, to this undergraduate law review, which I'm sure is, and they've been in a leadership role. So that's impressive. I'm sure that takes not an inconsequential amount of time. They're also in their pre-law society and have done mock trial. Okay. now I am reading their personal statement, and it is very interesting. It's all about their work as a delivery driver, which you may think, why is that interesting? I'll tell you why it's interesting, because I don't know much about that, right? Like I understand that such jobs exist. Obviously, I don't actually get a lot of carryout, so I don't have a lot of interactions with people doing it, and I've never done this job. But they really describe it in great detail and talk about all the challenges that come along with it, and the both like challenges like the need to always be smiling so you can hopefully get a tip, but also the challenges like if your car's not working, you can't work. And it's teaching me something, which I always like from a personal statement. So when I say that, I think sometimes people think I mean like you have to teach me something like physics. No, like just things about the way the world works that I don't know. I find that very interesting. It's an easier task to get engaged in a personal statement if I am picking up knowledge that I haven't had before, and that's being conveyed in an interesting way. And so then he pivots to that to talking about how this has led him to an interest in the law, because of the lack of security you have in such a job, because you're not working as an employee, you're an independent contractor, and all the things that go along with that, and how one state, California, has tried to address that, and how he would be interested in pursuing that as a legal issue. So that's also addressing the interest in law, and it's making me think it is a sincere interest in law, and he's thinking about the way law fits into the world. So even though he hasn't had an opportunity to do like a full-time summer job or something in a law firm, or volunteering at a nonprofit, for example, I really believe he has sincerely considered this path. He then writes an optional essay about his immigrant experience, and how much of a culture shock it was. He remembers, arriving here and starting in kindergarten, and how challenging that was. But he's telling, in some bullying that he received, but he's telling it very frankly, but he doesn't, he's very, he sounds very mature in his voice. He is not holding these 5-year-olds who are unkind to him and were bullying of him on the basis of his immigrant status. He's not acting like they should have been adults in their knowledge and maturity. He understands that they were 5 years old, but that doesn't mean it didn't harm him, right? He's doing both things at the same time. He's not unduly holding them responsible, but he is talking very sincerely about how hard that was for him. And I really like this tone. And it's also very, just as a practical matter, it's very well written. He has a very, very nice vocabulary and a very nice writing style. And then finally, he has a last optional essay, which is about why he is interested in Michigan in particular. And it's, has to do with the courses we have that he feels like will help him with his goals, his work goals, and then also stuff about the Ann Arbor area in general that he likes, and then also about an alum that he met and interacted with, who he liked, and he says that alum cemented Michigan as his first choice, which is nice, except I'll just note that we did admit him and he didn't enroll. However, I will say I think that is fine, that, when you're applying and you think a school is your first choice, or if you have, 3 tied for first choices, I think that is fine to say that. And even if it ends up not being true, you learn a lot over the course of the admissions process. And, I'm sure he had a good reason to change his mind. And I think that's just how it goes. So I would have loved it if he had enrolled here, because he seemed, rereading it, I am reminded anew how much I liked his application. Finally, he has a GPA addendum where he talks a lot about why he had to work so much and why his GPA is low. And it turns out it's not merely because, maybe I was getting the impression from everything he'd read that his family just didn't have a lot of money. He needed to work a lot in order to help pay tuition and living expenses. But it turns out that one of his parents was abusive, and he had to move out because of that. And he was homeless for a while, and that until he could get a car, and that's when he started doing the delivery work, and that's when he turned things around. So that is a pretty great story for why your GPA might not be in the stratospheric levels. Let's see what his transcript looks like and see if that seems consistent with the story. Okay, so I'm looking at his transcript. He has I'm looking first at his CAS report. He has a great LSAT in the 98th percentile and a GPA that is quite low, so 3.15. I certainly admit people with that kind of GPA, but it isn't common. So, and I'm going to do a more deep dive into the transcript than I might otherwise do, because I want to see exactly what's going on here. So in his first semester, he got a couple of low grades in challenging classes, a chemistry class and a calculus class, differential calculus, and A's otherwise. And then there is a semester that is all credit, no credit. That is a COVID semester, I'd say. Which is just, as a practical matter, it's interesting. I feel like I understand. I mean, we did a credit, no credit semester too. But it means that it did keep people from improving their GPAs, which they might otherwise have been able to do. So I think it makes sense that schools did it, but it also, in individual cases, like it might have hurt him because he couldn't climb up GPA wise. Next, then here's the semester where he talks about in his essay that he moved out and was homeless, and indeed he got a D that semester and a couple of B minuses, and now is when he says he turned it around, and indeed he did. He's all A's in the last 2 semesters, and some A pluses. So he really has turned things around. His letters of rec are positive. He has 3 from professors. They are all positive. They aren't super detailed. They're all unalloyed positive. No one says anything except good stuff, but it's pretty clear they don't know him super duper well. And that to me is not surprising, given what he's told me already about the challenges he has faced during college and the fact that he's had to work so much. So all told, this is someone who I think is very appealing and I would love to have in the class. So that's why we admitted old Jake. Some other lucky law school got him. Okay. Now, the third applicant we're going to talk about here is also someone we admitted, but who did not enroll. Okay, I'm going to try to comb through this one very quickly because I know I've been going on quite a while already. All right, so this person is, I'm looking at their application. They are going to an Ivy League school, and they say that they are from, okay, this is interesting. They, their mother is in New York and their father is in another country. So I'm assuming their parents are divorced. And they name another place as their hometown other than New York or this other country. So, there's some family disjunction there, and I wonder if they'll talk about that. They are fluent in French as well as English, obviously. And okay, and at this, oh, by the way, I didn't say what name I'm going to call this person. I am going to call her Amy. Okay, so Amy has a dual major in her undergrad of an engineering major and a poli-sci major. And she spells out for me in her resume that she has a 3.3 in engineering in her engineering major and a 4.0 in her poli-sci major. Now, in theory, that information is available to me in the transcript. And generally, I don't love it when people break out their majors, but usually when people do that, it's to show, oh, my overall GPA isn't that great, but I did really well in the courses I was interested in, which is just not a compelling tidbit. But here it's helpful because it's saying I have a not great GPA, and it's, and it's the distinction between two different majors. She did very well in poli-sci, which is the major that is most like what the kind of work you're going to do in law school. And she didn't do as well in her engineering major, which isn't as much like law school, but is extremely demanding and often has a really tough curve. So that is actually useful information here. And then I can see in her, she tells me some publications she's written, which is impressive. And they are all in the engineering field. So I do not understand any of it. But okay, that's good. That's impressive. And then she tells me about her work experience, which again is all in the engineering field. So that's interesting. Oh, no, that's wrong. I am wrong. She also has an internship in a nonprofit that has to do with election law. So she does have some law-related experience here. And then she tells me about her volunteer work. She's got a fair amount of volunteer work. She has done stuff with high school students. She has done stuff in local parks, and she has done stuff in a medical clinic. And she is involved in some extracurriculars that are both focused on the engineering major. So she really is an interesting mix of the engineering and the law stuff. And she seems very committed to both. So that is of note. In her personal statement, she talks about some work that she has done in connection with her engineering major, and in particular, how she does a lot of translation in relating to the engineering major. Oh, I see what she's talking about. I didn't understand this at first, but what she's talking about is she's talking about translating engineering terminology into more accessible English language. And then she pivots. Okay, this is very good, because she then pivots about talking about how she had to do translation for her parents, who it turns out were immigrants and didn't speak English super well. And so she was the family translator. That's a theme that I often see in personal statements, and she is handling it well. And then she explains that the reason her father is living in what I now know is both of her parents' home country is because he was arrested and deported. And so, I had assumed that their parents got divorced, but that's not quite what happened here. They are separated, but not because they wanted to be. And after her father was deported, her mother had to move in order to get a better paying job. And so that's why she has one place listed as her hometown, another place where her mother lives, another place where her father lives. So that is a pretty tough personal set of circumstances. And that makes me interested in her. Like, she's managed to achieve quite a lot with a lot of challenges thrown her way. She has an optional essay here explaining more about what it was like to be the child of immigrants and some of the challenges that came along with that, and how, low income her family is, and how she, how that has been a challenge for her. And it's interesting, she has not seemed to have to work for pay during the school year, unlike the candidate Jake that we talked about. And I think that is because, she's going to this Ivy League institution, which, one great thing about the Ivies is they have a lot of resources. And so I think they're probably supporting her very well with financial aid. Which is, that's one of the things you have to take into account as a, those different stories. Like, I don't know how there's no like formula where you weigh that, like, okay, this person's going to a public institution that isn't giving him as much support, and therefore he has to work a lot, and therefore his GPA isn't as good, versus this person who's going to, a fancier Ivy League institution who doesn't have to work because that school is supporting her. I mean, it's just, admissions is, you're trying to take all these different bits of information into account and fairly weight them, but there's no formula. So, okay. So now I'm looking at her transcript, and as was highlighted in her resume, she's got strong grades in all her poli-sci classes. As far as I can see, these are all A's, and then B's and C's in the engineering classes, mostly B's, but a couple of C's. And then she has 3 letters of rec from faculty members that are all incredibly supportive and detailed, and say not just great things about her intellectual capacity, they talk about her leadership qualities, and they talk about her as a human being, and they say she is modest and kind and a great listener and has a great deal of emotional and academic maturity and a winning personality. And all in all, that's sort of the cherry on top of what I had already thought from reading her application, which is this is someone we would love to have in our community. And that is why I admitted her, and alas, another great student who is at some other great law school. Our loss, someone else's gain. So I hope that has been a little illuminating for you. I don't want you to walk away with the idea that you have to have had some kind of challenging story of obstacles to overcome in order to get in if you're coming K through JD. That just is sort of a coincidence here. I think the lesson you should get from this is the 2 candidates who were successful had compelling personal stories that they managed to convey in a very positive sounding way, and they just seemed very appealing in their stories. And the first candidate just didn't, and that's really what it came down to. So if you're applying K through JD, is you just have less wiggle room, I guess might be one way of putting it. You have to do your best to make the most of your time in college. So both having jobs and being involved in extracurriculars and doing some service. And then you have to, it's good to come up with strong letters of rec if you possibly can. Although again, the second candidate didn't have that because of his personal circumstances. But that's another, that's important to try to do, get people who can talk in detail about you. And then most importantly, I would say when you are portraying yourself, you have to be thinking about the need to, the reader is going to be thinking, are you mature enough to go through this process? So you have to be thinking, do I sound mature and measured and taking things in stride in my writing? And I think that is where the first candidate really fell down. She didn't seem like that. Okay, well, I hope this has been useful to you. And as always, wherever you go blue. And thanks to Dustin, even though, you didn't really do anything here. It was all me pushing the little button on my phone.